Well, I suppose you're wondering why I'm working with an old camera like this when I'm supposed to be reviewing the 19mm PC-E lens. Well, the reason is that the best features about this lens were based on this very old technology that's been around for over 100 years. This is the first camera that I got as a professional photographer, and I got many years of good use out of it, shooting film, and it was my primary camera. But when the DSLR came along, many of us had to abandon film and move toward the more cost-effective DSLRs. And along the way, we gave up this feature here, this ability to do swings and tilts and lateral shifts and the rise and fall. All of these features were both on the front and the back of the camera, and in the absence of those features, certain things were lost when we went to digital. The main one being perspective control, second one being the ability to control depth of field through the tilts. So when you change the focal plane, you could adjust the area that was gaining the most from depth of field, and the same thing with swings. And but when it came to architectural photography, it was the ability to level the camera, have an absolutely vertical film plane, and then do a rise and fall with your lens to achieve correct perspective. And the way this is achieved is through the image circle. So here we have the image circle. It has the ability to move the picture backwards and forwards, and yet the picture never leaves the ground glass because the area of image that's being projected by the lens is larger than the format of the film. So let's have a look at those same features on the new 19mm PC-E lens from Nikkor. Incidentally, I have done an out-of-the-box first impressions video, as well as a review of the 6 months of testing this lens on other videos that you may want to check. But this video is primarily designed to show you how to use the lens, and it will also include some examples of photographs I've taken in the field. So at first glance, you'll see that this is quite a bulky lens and has a lot of knobs all over it. And that is because it has this ability, just like that 4x5 view camera you saw, to do rise and falls and tilts. And of course, if you swing this around, those tilts become swings. And if you turn this around, that rise and fall becomes shifts. So why do these features exist on this lens? They certainly add a lot to the cost of the lens, so there must be a very, very specific reason, and that is that we can control perspective by making the camera level and then raising and lowering the image within the frame of the camera to correct for composition, but the vertical lines of an architectural element are established by just leveling the camera. And then in terms of depth of field, you can change the plane of focus. And if you want to study the Scheimpflug principle, you'll understand that there's ways to calculate how to maximize it. But in this modern day and age, I think it's sufficient just to say, just turn your live view on, play with this thing with the lens wide open, and kind of just work your angle of tilt together with your focus, and you can actually visually see everything start either going into focus or out of focus. But it's not very scientific. It's a lot more intuitive nowadays because you can actually visualize with the viewfinder. So that brings you to the point, which is that this is not an autofocus lens. It's very, very much a hands-on lens that requires a lot of understanding of what you're doing and mastering that technique. But while you're working it out, the best advice I could give you is to turn the live view on and study your image through a loop, every corner of it, because as you gain one thing, you sometimes lose something else. For instance, if you're trying to photograph a long table from the front of the table to the other end of the table, all you have to do is just tilt this down, and you can, between tilting and fiddling with your focus, you can actually visually see in the viewfinder everything appear in focus. But if you're not careful and you overdo it, you can also witness by checking other parts of the image that the floor will be out of focus and the ceiling will be out of focus. So if you were planning on having the chandelier nice and sharp, you may give that up in order to maximize your depth of field. So like I said, you can do it the scientific way by studying the Scheimpflug principle. But I just think that ultimately, since you have to pay attention to the image through the viewfinder or through the live view, you can zoom in and very carefully make sure you have it just right. So before we turn to the pictures I've been taking, I'll just give you a couple of pointers about this lens and remind you that this is the latest lens in a series of PC lenses coming out from Nikon. The 24mm, which is the next widest angle to this, came out years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And some of the knobs are different and some of the functionalities are different. So I'll just quickly point out that we don't have a center index on the shifts any longer. So you'll actually have to look at the scale to see when you're centered. And there's no locking knob on the other side to hold it in place. I think it's a nice feature because now that they've got this new fancy knob, it's got a nice constant grip. And even though I'm going up and down, there's absolutely no slippage at all. And it doesn't look like it's going to be wearing out anytime soon to where I'd ever have to worry about that slippage. Another remarkable feature in this lens compared to the 24 is that there's an independent tab here that allows for the front of the lens to rotate independently of the back of the lens. So you can actually do compound movements where you've got a horizontal shift and a vertical downward turn of the lens for the tilt. But if you said, no, I want a horizontal shift, but I'd like to have a lateral swing, then you just rotate the front of the lens, leave the back of the lens alone. And if you turn your camera into the vertical format, the whole thing goes along with it. So you just basically move the tab and take the whole lens around, and you can go into the vertical format. So there's some of the pointers as to the mechanics of the camera. Now we'll turn our attention to the pictures and the results from the tests I've been making. So let's explore the depth of field control. This is achieved by tilting or swinging the lens, which is basically bending the front of the lens down or sideways or up. If we want to increase the depth of field, we can do something like in this shot where I tilted the lens down 2 increments, and I combined that with a vertical downward shift of 2 increments so I can see down to the table. And by taking a closer look in at this area here, we can see that it's sharp throughout the entire table, even though it's just a few inches in front of the lens. And if we look at the back of the picture, you'll see it's sharp as well. Now, correspondingly, you can swing that same element sideways and also achieve great depth of field along this plane of the bumper of the vehicle to achieve wonderful focus from front to back. And just as you can control depth of field maximizing it, you can also minimize it by reversing the effect. And in this particular case, I tilted the lens all the way up, and even though this is a large ice rink, it appears to have been a model photographed close up, giving a shallow depth of field. And if you really want to get creative, you can do compound movements to achieve interesting focus effects. With this model, I wanted to emphasize her long legs, and I wanted to make sure that she was in focus from the tip of her toe all the way to her face. So with 4 increments of downward tilt and then a 40-degree clockwise rotation of the lens, I was able to get a nice sharp plane of focus from the tip of her toe all the way up to her knee and hip and even her shoulder and even past her face to the back wall. Now whenever you shift a focal plane like this, it comes at the sacrifice of the perpendicular plane of focus, and in this case the plane going out from her body toward the horizon. And if you look closely here, you'll see that already the foot that's behind the front foot is already getting soft. By the time it gets to the windowsill and beyond, it's very, very soft. And this is done on purpose. So the result is that I ended up with like a cone of a focus area. And to finish the picture off, I did a 5.5 increment downward vertical shift and made sure that all my vertical lines were lined up nicely. So the remarkable thing about this picture is not that I was able to get this incredible depth of field, but the circumstances under which I was able to achieve this. For instance, she's a live model. I can't get the shutter speed too low or I'll have her movement in the picture. And if I want to keep the ISO at a reasonable level, I can't start upping the ISO to play it safe. And also in addition to that, I can't expect very soft backgrounds if my f-stop's too high. So this was a delicate balance of getting it all to fit together, and this was achieved with an f-stop of only 6.3. So now we turn our attention to perspective control. And just like I said before, this is largely determined by the size of the image circle, which allows you to move the image across the sensor to achieve the specific crop that you want. Here I have taken 13 images individually and assembled them into a composite that represents the image circle of this particular 19mm lens. And right there in the middle is the actual size of the sensor to let you know how I built this picture. So you can shoot here, or here, or here, or any of these places. You get the message. So because of this ability to keep the camera perfectly square and level in both axes, you're able to keep your vertical lines vertical, and then with the shifts you can slide around, move around that image circle to create just the right crop. And here we have a street scene where the lens was moved 5 increments. Here's another street scene, 7 increments, which is more dramatic, and yet more dramatic again. And this one's a downward shift, and back to a vertical shift. So this is probably a good time to answer the question of which is better, to stick with what you have, which is a typical wide-angle lens, and compare it to the performance of this new lens, given that everybody's got a wide-angle lens, but not everybody can afford the more expensive PC lens, so why add another wide-angle lens to your collection? So this is a test I did to explore that idea. So I went downtown and found a restaurant and set up the 14 to 24 millimeter. So the shot comes out pretty good because the camera was level, and I think it looks pretty, but unfortunately half the picture is the foreground and the top of the picture is not seen, so it's less than ideal. So then the normal response would be to just angle the camera up so that the lens can see higher up the scene and less of the foreground. So even though the horizon has been moved just a small amount from the middle of the picture slightly down in order to see higher up the building. Can you see the convergence already appearing, where the verticals are starting to tilt inwards, giving the illusion that these buildings are falling over backwards? Let's just fix it in Photoshop. And of course that can be done. So Photoshop will come along and stretch out the top end and compress the lower end and get those lines straight. After that, you just crop off the excess image, and now you have what most would consider a reasonably good sharp picture. So let's now compare that to the 19mm PC-E lens. And here we have a recording of what I see in live view, and it's basically just showing how once you have got the camera level, you can move the picture around and achieve the composition you want. So here's the moment of truth. If we were to zoom in on an area and compare that to the same area on the 14 to 24mm lens, you'll notice quite a remarkable difference in sharpness. So here we go back to the 19 again. So it's far superior to get this corrected in the lens than it is to correct it in Photoshop, primarily because you're losing detail on the upper end due to stretching, and you're losing detail on the lower end of the picture due to compression. So the last of the three sections I want to talk about in terms of the major functions of this lens is the shifts and stitching. If we were to look at the old ways, the good old days of doing it in Photoshop, you set your camera up in the vertical orientation, absolutely level, so that there's no distortions, and you level your tripod so that as you rotate the camera on that tripod, it remains perpendicular and situated in nice square horizontal and vertical axes. And start firing away. So we got first shot, second shot, and third shot. And then of course in Photoshop you merge them together, and this is what you get. In order to make these pieces fit together, the program has had to stretch the pixels on the extreme right and extreme left and compress the pixels in the center of the image to get these things all to fit together. And the workable crop area is that area in red. So that ends up being the finished picture. And if it's going to be small, like a web page or whatever, that's fine. But once again, just like with the image of the restaurant, once you look in really closely and zoom in, you'll see that these stretched pixels have been made vertical, but at a serious sacrifice to quality and sharpness. So if we were to do this properly using the 19mm PC-E lens, let's explore how that's done. So once again, you get your horizontal and vertical axes lined up, and go to the left side of your scene and capture the first picture. Go to the middle of your scene, capture the second picture, and then shift over to the extreme right hand side of your scene and capture a picture again. When the three are combined, it'll produce a crop of a very, very wide angle of view that I would call a panorama. Here's an example right here. This is a series of three shots combined, and it spans an enormous amount of the space in this limited area. The skies of West Texas are enormous, and yet this lens was able to span the size of an enormous storm. And in the Grand Canyon, I was able to span 3 pictures to create this very dramatic panorama here. And I think this is a good time to also mention that because of the extreme wide-angle nature of this lens, this is a good example of where you scale your foreground to match your middle ground to match your far distance, And in the case of these cacti, they're just a few inches tall, and yet they are proportionally in balance with what is essentially about a 3,000 foot rise to the top of that rim. So let's now look at the vertical shift equivalent of working within the image circle. And when they stitch together, because the camera itself has not moved and the perspective of the image crossing that sensor is consistent, so when Photoshop combines them, there's no corrective distortions going on. It's pretty seamless stitching. So in this scene I wanted to look down on the table without losing the chandeliers, so I just took a lower shot and an upper shot and combined them. And once again over here I wanted to see the span of these arcs all the way to the ceiling required a vertical shift and stitch together. I could easily have got this entire bridge in a single shot, but being able to get the ice in the foreground as well as all the way to the top of the flagpole, it was nice knowing that I could get that by just taking two pictures and stitching them. And then of course if you flip the whole situation over to the vertical orientation on the camera and do once again 3 moves, top, center and bottom, I was able to get an extremely wide angle view of this staircase. And ultimately, if you really want to maximize as much of the image circle as you want and still have it in a picture frame, you could go for a square format. It does require taking 7 separate images to get maximum coverage and even exposure and sharpness, but it results in an enormous file size that will take your 36 megapixel camera and turn it into a 90 to 100 megapixel camera. So in addition to being able to get very large and wide angle shots, you get incredible detail while you're at it. So now that we're concluding this video, I'd like to remind you once again to take a look at the very first video, which was my initial out-of-the-box impression, and then this second video about my overall impression, whether I would recommend this lens or not, based on my experience with it over a 6-month period, testing it in various conditions. And but now this third video has primarily been about using the lens and how to make the most of it. And but I would like to wrap this up by saying I really do recommend this lens very, very highly. If your work is going to be small and on the internet, where no one's really going to scrutinize too carefully, then sure, you can get a lot done with those normal wide-angle zooms. But if your work is going to be blown up large, like a full-page spread in an architectural magazine, or a cover of a brochure that covers a product, where everything needs to be sharp and controlled, this is an incredible lens. I believe it fulfills many of the weaknesses I was experiencing with the older lenses, and it certainly satisfies most of what I was missing with the old viewfinder cameras. And I'm happy to add it to my arsenal of lenses. So thank you very much. I'd love it if you could subscribe, and I'd encourage you to leave your comments in case there's something else that we could learn.